After a decade of plotting and planning to become Prime Minister, Gordon Brown finally ascended to the throne in June last year.
People say to me, would you recommend this job to anyone else? I say, not yet.
Since then, there's been the self-wounding blunder of the election that never was.
I was in favour of going for an early election.
No, I wasn't particularly in favour of an early election.
That was a fiasco, which did the government a lot of damage.
There have been massacres at the polls and accusations of incompetence.
Gordon used to tell this joke himself. The first thing you do is you blame your predecessor, and the second thing you do is you blame, some other event.
Tonight, we talk to cabinet ministers and those close to Gordon Brown to bring you the inside story of how honeymoon turned into nightmare.
Thank you for your concern about Britain and your concern about the leadership of Britain. Someone said to me, when you see the state of the country, you pray for the MPs. He said, no, when I see the state of the MPs, I pray for them.
No previous Prime Minister of modern times moved into number 10 better qualified and prepared, at least on paper, to do the job. 10 years as a highly formidable Chancellor and the most powerful ever holder of that office. So dominant was he that no cabinet colleague dared to stand against him for the leadership of the Labour Party. He became Prime Minister not by election, but by coronation.
He was Tony Blair's natural successor. There was nobody else with his stature, his grasp and his strategic vision.
The expectation on the left was that Gordon Brown wouldn't be like Tony Blair, and that was enough for many people.
Some predicted that it would be a control freaks government, especially those who'd been bruised by him in the past. Sensitive to that criticism, he made a particular effort to suggest that he was interested in cabinet colleagues' opinions.
Nobody quite knew what Gordon's style would be. It was immediately clear that he wanted to involve people.
The cabinet is now more collegial. We used to discuss a lot of things in Tony's cabinet, but often they were discussing how we present policies.
It had also been said of Gordon Brown that he was a secretive, vengeful factionalist. So he made a point of promoting ministers who'd been close to his predecessor. Were you surprised when he said, come and be Home Secretary?
I was very surprised, and he said it, incidentally, with a twinkle in his eye, and he said, I think this might be a bit of a shock.
In another gesture to show that his government would not be narrowly tribal, he brought into it non-party animals.
Goats, as we're called, the government of all the talents, and all the civil servants call us goats, and we don't mind, really. It's quite a nomenclature we quite relish.
When he offered you the job, did he ask you to join the Labour Party?
Yes.
What did you say to him?
He said, will you join the party? And I said, no, I won't.
Some began to wonder just where this would all end when the former Iron Chancellor had the former Iron Lady round for tea.
Joining the Labour Party, are you?
The trouble is that the tent was only half filled and wasn't complemented by some of the more radical elements that we could have brought in to cement a coalition of interest that should be the modern Labour Party. So we've tilted only one way, and that is to the right.
His new recruits also included a former First Sea Lord and Chief of Defence Intelligence, whose reluctance to join the government was finally worn down by Gordon Brown's persistence.
He put it very clearly to me that he felt the security and safety of the nation was the highest priority of any Prime Minister. Talked this through and said, I really do believe you can do something for the nation, and really it was impossible not to.
There's initial speculation that an attack could be timed to coincide with a new Prime Minister.
Gordon Brown had been in number 10 less than 48 hours when he had to face his first crisis, a terrorist attack.
This latest incident reinforces the need for the public to remain vigilant.
It was the Thursday that he did his reshuffle and he asked me to be Home Secretary. And then it was very early on the Friday morning that we both, and, you know, he was woken up, I think, I was woken up with the news about the car in Haymarket.
After the plot to bomb the Haymarket in London came the attack on Glasgow Airport, followed by widespread floods. It was a baptism of fire and water for the new Prime Minister.
You couldn't have hoped for a worse set of combination of circumstances. I think we were all waiting for the plague of locusts to come down.
What came next was not locusts, but it was a plague.
I was actually in the car with him when he received one of the phone calls about the foot and mouth, for example, and actually he was once again just sort of incredibly calm.
His predecessor had always looked good in a crisis. Gordon Brown knew he had to project himself as in command.
The brilliant thing that Gordon Brown managed to forge in those first few months was almost transcend normal political divides to become, some have argued, the sort of father of the nation approach.
It could be said that the new Prime Minister was tested by just the right size of challenges, including 2 terrorist attacks, which thankfully killed only 1 bomber.
Certainly Mother Luck was with Gordon in those early days. You know, if you're going to have foot and mouth, it's really rather nice if it is 12 animals. And if you are going to have a terrorist attack, that they're so deranged that an ambulance crew who are also doing another job happen to notice that there's a car misbehaving itself.
The crises you deal with are the crises that come along. And it was serious, and it did involve multiple attacks, and thank goodness nobody was injured, but you don't know that at the time that you're dealing with it.
Having had their doubts about how he would perform, colleagues and the media were impressed by the apparent calm with which Gordon Brown rose to these events. But he also displayed some of his insecurity, some of his fear of ever relaxing his grip.
On foot and mouth, he ran straight back from his holiday, almost with unhealthy vigour and speed. The idea that a couple of days with the kids, bucket and spades, and I've got to get back because I'm so bored, I'm not sure that necessarily set the right example.
I think that period shows you what Gordon's great skills are. Tremendous commitment to the job, absolutely instinctively cancelling a holiday the moment it had started, simply because the right place to be was back in charge.
In the midst of the summer emergencies, senior officials at Number 10 jokingly asked each other, what next? What next was the first run on a British bank in well over a century. This was the crisis that provoked most fear within Downing Street.
When the queues started, the Prime Minister spoke to me, and I know he'd spoken to others within government, and yes, we were anxious about it.
Of course it was a concern, because I was perfectly well aware that the signals this was sending out was far from reassuring. People were starting to get really worried.
It was stunning to see these lines of people waiting to get their money out of Northern Rock. And I remember the 2 reactions in America. One was, my God, they've got a bank run. And the other is, look how nice and orderly the Brits are when they queue up.
Could I have the first 5 things, please?
After 3 days, the immediate crisis subsided when the Prime Minister made a promise to savers in the troubled bank.
The deposits of Northern Rock savers are indeed guaranteed, and at the same time we're showing that when these issues happen in Britain, we are strong enough as an economy to be able to deal with them.
This was far from the end of the Northern Rock saga, but the opinion pollsters reported that the public were glad to have Gordon Brown at the helm. In fact, the more difficult things were, the more popular he appeared to become.
I remember people being very sceptical about Gordon as Prime Minister in the business community, and that worry and concern just turned absolutely on its head within a few months of his premiership, so that by September, him having taken over at the end of June, the same people were saying, well, I was wrong about Gordon, he's very impressive.
Just 3 months after he'd moved into number 10, the polls were even suggesting that he would win a general election. He and the country were about to find out how good he really was at making big decisions. There was the atmosphere of an election rally about Gordon Brown's first party conference as Prime Minister. With Labour's lead in the polls still growing, more and more people were wondering whether there would be an election that autumn.
People say to me, would you recommend this job to anyone else? I say, not yet.
Gordon comes from a background of preachers, and Gordon's at his best really with a kind of church of believers. He's absolutely spellbinding because he's in a room with people who share his values, and he can lift them out of their seats with his kind of fervour.
We will meet our environmental, our economic, our security challenges, not by splitting apart, but when we as Great Britain stand united together.
I remember editors of national newspapers, including The Telegraph and News International, all of them contemptuous of David Cameron, and eulogising Gordon's strength and his capacity as a Prime Minister, and really praising him to the rooftops.
In the hothouse environment of the conference, aides to the Prime Minister and some of his closest allies in the cabinet encouraged the idea that he should cash in his popularity with the voters and call an election.
We all asked questions in code, and we got answers in code, such as, will it be safe to go off on our half-term holiday at the end of October? I'm not sure, especially if you're going abroad. Better stay closer to home. Those sorts of conversations were being had all the time.
At a conference, everyone's in a bubble. Everyone's talking to everyone else, and it was the only thing that anybody was talking about.
Free beer for all the workers. I mean, you could have Guinness, you could have beer.
His media strategists were already developing election slogans, while aides anxious to show the softer side of Gordon arranged for him to be interviewed on the conference stage by a friendly Mariella Frostrup.
Before we went on, I was taken to Gordon, and he was sitting in this sort of back room in the sort of depths of the building behind the big conference hall, and we were just left in there for about 2 hours, and I was slightly struck by what a lonely job it is. It's been a very successful 3 months. It's been a very successful conference, and I wondered if in the intimate atmosphere of the conference centre here you wanted to illuminate me on when you felt would be a good time for an election.
Charming as you are, Mariella, I think the first person I would have to talk to is the Queen.
Now it wasn't just aides and acolytes. With that unwise tease, the Prime Minister himself had openly joined in exciting election speculation.
He became increasingly attracted to the idea because he saw it as a way of destabilising the Conservative Party and a way, essentially, of making political mischief.
It's hard to see, in retrospect, how that much speculation could have been avoided, given the fact that there was active consideration being given.
By the end, I believed that he was going to have an election. I even wrote my election address. Fortunately, I didn't put a date on it.
People were frantically drafting manifestos. I remember as Secretary of State for Work and Pensions being asked my views on the forward policies and on other ideas for the manifesto, which I gave.
I remember going away that weekend, talking to my agent and preparing the ground, I think, as every MP in the land was doing. So there was no doubt that it looked like a no-brainer that we were heading for an election.
Gordon Brown had stoked election speculation in the belief that it would frighten and divide the Tories when they met for their conference in Blackpool the next week.
Ladies and gentlemen, David Cameron.
In fact, the threat of an election did the opposite, rallying them behind David Cameron, who rose to the challenge with a look no notes speech.
So it might be a bit messy, but it will be me. We will say to people...
While the Tory leader presented himself as unspun, Gordon Brown looked like he was practicing the dark art of media manipulation when he timed a visit to Iraq for the middle of the Conservative conference.
By the end of the year, indeed by Christmas, 1,000 of our troops can be brought back.
Up until that moment, people had thought that Brown was perhaps a bit more sincere, a bit more open, a bit more transparent than Blair. He sacrificed all that And I think it was a grave, grave political error.
He couldn't make up his own mind whether or not to call an election, so the Prime Minister was consulting the Cabinet, only to find that his senior ministers were utterly divided.
Gordon asked me, as he asked others, whether or not I thought there should be an election. I told him that I did want one and the reasons why I did.
I was all sceptical about an early election. It depended on the arguments.
Some people were putting forward the argument, well, as a new Prime Minister, should he somehow seek a mandate? But then others were reminding us that if you have an election late on in the year, it gets darker earlier and then fewer people vote.
The possibility of knocking on doors in October, November, with dark nights closing in. You know, I am a party activist and I have been for 30 years, and getting your vote out is crucial.
The Labour Party spent more than £1 million preparing for the election that never was. Several members of the Cabinet told me that they thought Gordon Brown had let things reach such a fever pitch that he would simply have to go to the country.
When I was asked by senior people very close to Gordon what my view was, I asked two questions. I said, what are the polls in the marginal seats? And I asked another question. What is the polling in London and the South? Because my political antennae told me that it didn't feel very good. They didn't know. So those pressing for an early election and talking it up to journalists at the party conference did not have an answer to those two crucial questions. That worried me.
We can't know for certain what would have happened if Gordon Brown had gone for it. What we do know is that he and Labour were fairly popular then, and he and his government are desperately unpopular now. I also know, because they told me so at the time, that many senior Conservatives thought they would have been defeated in an autumn election. Had there been an election, do you think Labour would have won it?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, I think he probably would have done.
Yeah, I think he would have won it.
Almost certainly before we went to nursery school together.
Murray Elder has been a friend of Gordon Brown since childhood and is one of his closest advisors. What was your view? Did you think an early election might be a good idea, or were you against it?
No, I didn't see any merit in an early election.
And you said that to Gordon?
I never got the impression that Gordon was so determined in having an early election that I needed to say anything very much about it. I mean, it seemed to me, you know, there are some sort of long-term rules in politics that if you want to win an election, you ought to be ahead in the polls for really quite a long time, and 2 months doesn't constitute a really long time.
And you think that was actually his view as well?
Yeah.
Given that the cautious Gordon Brown was never totally convinced of the case for an election, it was extraordinary that this supposed master strategist had left himself with no exit which would not be a humiliation. A fortnight after the Labour conference, he finally called the whole thing off.
Can we just be absolutely clear here? Are you suggesting that your decision not to hold a general election had absolutely nothing to do with the state of the opinion polls and everything to do with your decision to give yourself more time?
Yeah, I considered holding an election. Obviously, I saw the opinion polls. I also heard from my marginal seat members of Parliament that if we'd had an election, they would have won their seats.
The clunking fist had punched himself in the face. Journalists taunted him to admit that he'd run away in the face of a turn in the polls.
Can you say, hand on heart, the change in the opinion polls was not the trigger for your change of heart over the election?
Yes, I can, because I've told you the basis on which I made my decision.
Surely you changed your mind because you thought you might lose. Why can't you just admit that?
No, what happened was I considered it, and I came back to my first instinct.
7 brown bottles sitting on a wall, and if 1 brown bottle should accidentally fall, there'll be 6 brown bottles sitting on a wall.
Iron Gordon was now rechristened Bottler Brown. Even his closest and most long-standing allies see this self-inflicted wound as the moment when it all began to unravel for the Prime Minister.
The sense of it being on and it being off was probably a watershed looking back at it.
Why was that a watershed?
Well, because I think people felt that if there wasn't going to be an election, the speculation should have been damped down earlier than it was.
The mistake was to allow this particular train to leave the station in the first place when you weren't clear about the destination. And that was a fiasco from which did the government a lot of damage.
It was like one of those sci-fi movies in which a mad scientist throws a switch and suddenly all the polarities are reversed. Gordon Brown's positives in public perception were transformed overnight into negatives, from decisive to dithering, from man of great conviction to man of narrow calculation, from strong to cowardly.
He's the first Prime Minister in history to flunk an election because he thought he was going to win it.
What Gordon Brown needed now was to recover his footing by offering a period of calm and purposeful government. Instead, he looked frantic and desperate when he tried to mimic Tory proposals on tax.
When George Osborne made a series of announcements about tax changes on inheritance tax and the taxing of non-doms at the Conservative Party conference, we were told by the Labour Party that this was irresponsible and that the ideas would collapse under the weight of their scrutiny within a couple of days.
When the debate comes on these proposals, I relish the chance both for the forensic examination of them, because they do not add up.
Then a week later, we discovered that those ideas were then being implemented by Alistair Darling. So ideas which were rubbish a week beforehand were now Labour policy.
From today, I can announce that combined tax-free allowances for their estates will not be the current 300,000, but up to 600,000.
It looked like it was solely about political positioning, and it looked like we were playing fast and loose with the electorate, and that was crystallised in the sort of look in Gordon Brown's eye, which signalled that it was all an exercise in smoke and mirrors.
Very close friends of Alistair Darling have told me that this was not really his autumn mini-budget at all. It had been imposed on him by the Prime Minister.
Anyone who thinks that Gordon Brown has given up being Chancellor doesn't know Gordon Brown. Alistair Darling is a man of some modest ability, but Gordon's, let's say, heavily involved in fiscal policy.
The Chancellor now admits to regrets about that mini-budget.
You know, if you were able to wind the clock back and do things differently, of course you'd have done things differently.
Would you have done that pre-budget report differently?
Well, I would. Well, if I knew now what I knew then, yeah, of course there'd be some things that would be different. I actually think the inheritance tax changes that I made do have some merit.
I don't know why he even bothered to turn up.
The Tories claimed that they were now winning the battle of ideas, that the government was so short of policies that it was having to steal Conservative ones.
Let the Tories have the initiative. I mean, Gordon was the king of the hill on tax policy, and suddenly he's playing Me Too catch-up. And I think that was a very bad policy decision, a bad political decision.
An awful autumn was followed by a wicked winter.
I was phoned at home on a Saturday morning, and my initial reaction is probably unbroadcastable.
The Chancellor had just learnt that the government had lost 2 computer disks containing the personal details of more than 20 million people.
It includes child benefit numbers, national insurance numbers, and where relevant, bank or building society account details.
When they told Gordon that the disks containing half the nation's details had been lost, he's supposed to have been so furious that he kicked the nearest desk, and indeed kicked it so hard that he kicked it over.
He'd soon be kicking the furniture again. Labour had hoped that it had heard the last of donation scandals with the departure of Tony Blair. And yet Gordon Brown had been Prime Minister for less than 6 months when leading figures in the government were engulfed by more of them.
One thing you thought we might have learnt was that cash for honours was something to close the door on. So that was something that was, you know, from the past and reared up again. But obviously that just seemed to be another thing that was just keeping the government mired in trouble after trouble.
I knew nothing of these donations. I had no knowledge until Saturday night. Neither did I have any knowledge of this practice.
I severely and seriously regret.
Peter Hain was forced to resign when allegations of undisclosed donations to his deputy leadership campaign were referred to the police.
As soon as I was able to, thank you very much indeed.
Hey, were you surprised?
Well, of course, everybody was frustrated and angry about it. Not least me, when I found myself suddenly engulfed in it. Gordon was very sympathetic, and absolutely exasperated as to how legislation had been put in place by us, by him and by me, because we voted for this legislation, which made the candidate in an internal party election responsible, and responsible alone.
Gordon Brown was so aggrieved to be hit by a donation scandal that he told one intimate, "It eats my soul." Though he was not personally to blame for the latest donations uproar, it added to the sense that this was an old government and one that was adrift.
I think what disappointed me, and I think disappointed a lot of people, was that when he'd actually got to the top, there wasn't a great deal of steam left. He seemed to have run out of ideas, seemed to have run out of big projects, and that by itself makes you at the mercy of events.
The House has noticed the Prime Minister's remarkable transformation in the last few weeks from Stalin to Mr. Bean.
Did you see the look on his face when you delivered that line?
Well, he was trying to smile, bravely, I think. And that's the way he deals with the atmosphere in the Commons. And several members of the Cabinet came up afterwards and said they'd rather enjoyed the joke.
It was a good moment for Vince Cable. It was a very good line.
Did you find it difficult not to laugh?
No, I've got used to being not showing my emotions at Prime Minister's questions.
If you looked at the rest of the Cabinet, you could see that they felt, well, a mingled sense of pity and bewilderment. They thought, we're trapped. We've got this guy leading. He was supposed to be the person who would transform our fortunes, and now we're landed with someone who's a joke.
From the start, Gordon Brown has struggled with presentation.
I've never believed presentation should be a substitute for policy.
A misplaced autocue made it look as though he was addressing the country through double glazing.
There is the sense that the Gordon Brown visit has come up a little short.
On an important visit to the United States, he was upstaged by the Pope. He developed a bad habit of trying to keep everyone happy by splitting the difference.
He's on his way. He's mid-flight as we speak, so you haven't got long to wait for him to be here.
Turning up late to sign the Lisbon Treaty annoyed other European leaders, while also attracting the ridicule of anti-Europeans in Britain. He was scorched by the Olympic torch, mocked for allowing a shell-suited troop of Chinese goons into Downing Street and standing next to the torch, but refusing to touch it. He agreed to meet the Dalai Lama, but not at number 10. The presentational weakness that was most important was Gordon Brown's apparent inability to show empathy with voters.
Prime Ministers do need to be able to, in a sense, their body language needs to show they're at ease when they're trying to communicate with voters.
And Gordon finds that difficult?
I think very difficult. He's a private person, and therefore, naturally, he finds that difficult.
Do you think you can learn it, or is that just something you have or you don't have?
I think it's now obvious it's quite difficult to learn.
Many friends of this Prime Minister will testify to the vast difference between the Gordon Brown they meet in private and the Gordon Brown who is on show to the public. The private Brown can be thoughtful and clever. He can be seized by titanic rages. He can break down in tears. He can also be witty, warm and self-deprecating. But in public, he struggles to display any emotional range to the voters. Put him in front of a camera and Gordon Brown finds it hard to do human.
Believe it or not, I think he does enjoy being Prime Minister. It maybe doesn't look that way to people where he carries all his troubles on his shoulders.
All in all, if you said to him, Gordon, are you glad you've got this job? He would say yes. If you said, are you having fun? He would say some days.
The challenge that Gordon Brown has got is that people clearly find it hard to hear his message. You know, all through his time, before he was Prime Minister, there have been various kind of rather clumsy attempts to, you know, talk about the fact that he likes the Arctic monkeys or whatever it might be, and to kind of humanise him.
Well, the X Factor was another.
X Factor, and pictures of him watching TV and all this kind of stuff. And I'm afraid that, you know, the great British public tend to think this is all a little bit sad.
I think there is a Grand Canyon-esque
chasm between his public and his private persona. I mean, in private life, he's witty and warm and engaging. He can seem very austere in his public persona. And it's a shame. And I think it's just because we live in a soundbite culture. Unlike, Sarkozy, who was hemorrhaging emotion about his wife to an embarrassing degree, Gordon loves Sarah very passionately, but he's very, very private about it. But he did have this surprise party for us. So, he organised for all of her friends to come to Downing Street. We're clackety-clacking down the Dickensian cobblestone street of Downing Street, giggling, trying to be quiet.
I'm not sure if Sarah's surprise party was the brainchild of Gordon, but he did go along with it very affably.
He then said, I'll be your wine waiter for the evening, because it was a girls-only gathering. He put his little tea towel over his arm. And I said, it's traditional that we always pinch the bottom of the wine waiter.
It's not a moment that stands out in my mind. Perhaps I missed it, but then Kathy Lette trying to pinch someone's bottom is hardly headline news, is it?
Now, any other red-blooded man, even you, would probably, be a bit shaken at having 15 feisty females chasing you around the furniture. But, he just quipped and poured champagne and was fantastically charming and dodged our advances quite brilliantly.
We had a few glasses of wine, a few cocktail sausages, and I think we were all home by 10 o'clock.
Gordon Brown's reputation with the public was founded on his 10 successful years as Chancellor and the belief that he knew how to take a decision. But the government still hadn't made one about Northern Rock. Several weeks after the bank's collapse, its long-term future was still in doubt. One of the reasons Gordon Brown hesitated was his fear that nationalisation would be interpreted as a lurch back to old Labour.
A cloud over the decision was the N-word, nationalisation, because the fear was that this was just tantamount to Gordon Brown hitting the rewind button to circa 1983,
We did try and, see if we could get someone to buy it. But in the autumn, the conditions got worse and worse and worse. And you just couldn't sell a bank at that time. The people who were interested were offering to take it off our hands at a fraction of what it was worth.
It was fairly clear that a solution that involved the taxpayer taking the risks and a private owner, such as Richard Branson, taking the profit, that was never going to be acceptable.
The protracted delay was causing confusion at the heart of Britain's financial system.
In December of 2007, when I talked to some officials at the Bank of England, they had a couple of concerns. They wished the government would give them clearer direction as to what to do, and that the government had been more active. They felt there was a kind of paralysis at the government level in handling this crisis, and they were pretty cranky about it.
Not until February 2008, 6 months after Northern Rock got into trouble, did the government announce its final decision.
I'd taken that week we get off in February and gone to Cuba. And on the Sunday my phone rang and Gordon came on the line and explained that the government had decided to take Northern Rock into public ownership. And I said, Gordon, I'm in Havana, Cuba. Here all the banks are nationalised. And he said, it's only temporary.
There was certainly an argument for proceeding cautiously when it came to Northern Rock. Trouble was, Gordon Brown was now getting a reputation for being slow to make any decisions, large or small. As Chancellor, he'd had the luxury of being able to concentrate on one big thing at a time. As Prime Minister, he found 100 different issues tumbling onto his desk every day. Ministers began to complain that the machinery of government was seizing up. Even one of Mr. Brown's oldest and closest allies in the cabinet told me that number 10 was in chaos.
One of the difficulties was, on so many subjects, people would behave in the same way as they had done as Chancellor and just walk in and speak to him. And actually, you need more structure than that. And I think that's really what was the case. Of course, Gordon's other issue, which was certainly not something his predecessor had, was that Gordon spends a lot of time looking at emails.
What's the earliest you've received an email from Gordon?
When I log in the next morning, I'll find there's a response sometime just before 6 o'clock in the morning, and so I'm already 4 hours late in responding to it.
One of his great difficulties, perhaps, is that he's not nimble enough. He's been described, as the eternal scholarship boy, which indeed he was, and that particularly if things go wrong, he just feels, if I work harder, then it'll come right, I'll get the right answer.
My school motto, I will try my utmost.
I told him he should have had a holiday last summer, and I think he should have done. And I've told him that, there are times when I think he ought to back off and have a bit of a rest.
Gordon Brown could not stop himself micromanaging, involving himself in trivial Whitehall arguments that should have been well below his pay grade. When the Minister for Trade got into a squabble with civil servants about his limousine, the row went all the way up to the Prime Minister.
The problem about the car was there was a list of what ministers could have. And I looked at this list, and none of them were made in Britain. And I said, well, I don't mind what it is, but you've got to get me a car made in Britain. And it was no, and I said yes, and it went up to Downing Street. And I saw him a few days later to do, and he said, have you got your Jaguar yet? So I knew he'd been asked.
As Brown's premiership got into deeper trouble, he began to suffer from comparisons with the deftness with which Blair had managed to shimmy his way through problems. Does he take longer to take decisions than Tony Blair?
On the whole, yes, he does. Again, I don't think that's a sin. Tony was a much more instinctive decision maker. Sometimes with Tony you had the reverse problem, that you'd find there was a decision, then you had to think of the arguments in favour of it. Sometimes you'd read about the decisions in the newspapers from time to time. It's not happened all that often, but if you were about to appear on the Today programme or make a statement in Parliament, it concentrated the mind.
When Blair was in Number 10, he'd tell his civil servants to read the papers and give him a short list of options, and in the morning he'd make a decision. But with Gordon, it is said, he sends for the papers, he reads them late into the night, and then the next morning he sends for more papers.
The strain was etched all over the Prime Minister's face, not least because he was getting so little sleep. On New Year's Eve, normally a quite important date to Scotsmen, he was so tired that he took himself off to bed at 10 o'clock.
I think the Number 10 has tended to try to get involved in too many things. And Gordon talks a lot about his values. Now, values are fine, we've all got values. What actually matters is what is the hierarchy of values? What are the values that matter most to you? And I think part of the problem now is that, is that Gordon will say on Monday that social justice matters to him, on Tuesday it's economic competitiveness, on Wednesday it's sustainability, on Thursday it's global poverty, on Friday it's Britishness. Actually, people need to say, well, what is the thing that matters to you most?
One thing that mattered to him was demonstrating that he could be as tough-sounding on terrorism as Tony Blair. Gordon Brown decided he would try to extend to 42 days, the time terror suspects can be detained without charge.
Well, one of the things, of course, that the first few days and the terror attacks taught both of us, I think, was what we'd been briefed about, the complexity and the nature and the scale of what we were facing as a terrorist threat was real.
This provoked fierce opposition within the Labour Party. The director of Liberty, Shami Chakrabarti, went to work on Labour MPs, trying to persuade them to vote against the government.
So I thought, nice chance to meet her, she's a bonny-looking girl. And when she came, she shook me to my roots.
We talked for a bit about what it might feel like to be locked up for 6 weeks, to not really know why, because there is no charge.
Now, what would be my reaction? That was the question I asked myself. And I thought, dear God, I'd be absolutely bloody furious and hugely resentful. And what would that make me do?
After a little while, he said, thank you very much, you've done enough. And he, rather surprisingly, picked up the telephone to phone the Home Secretary and say that he changed his mind.
It wasn't just backbenchers who opposed the government. So did the Director of Public Prosecutions and the last Attorney General. Even Gordon Brown's own Security Minister had, at least for a time, his doubts.
I still need to be fully convinced that we absolutely need more than 28 days, and I also need to be convinced what's the best way of doing that.
An hour after detonating that explosion, Lord West arrived in Downing Street for a meeting and came face to face with the Prime Minister.
I didn't know there was concern in Number 10 until I got into Number 10, actually. But I got from the press people, there was a bit of a, oh my, he said sort of thing, and I got that message. Gordon's only question to me, he said, Alan, do you really believe there won't be a case beyond 28? And I said, no, that's not what I'm saying. I want to make absolutely sure that there's no other way of getting around that.
Later the same day, the Admiral had done a hard tack and come back into line.
I haven't changed my position. I think being a simple sailor and not a politician, maybe I didn't choose my words well. What I think we do need to do is prove to the British people, with the evidence, that this is the case.
Well, you're not a simple sailor at all, are you? You've been first Sea Lord or anything but simple.
Yeah, that's one of those sort of things, really. I thought it was. I was trying to put it in perspective with the media, really. Now, I suppose the lesson I learnt is that one can't be quite as open as that.
Combating terrorism was causing passionate disagreement within the Labour Party, but one reason that many of them had long preferred Gordon Brown to Tony Blair was because they thought he had a deeper commitment to helping the disadvantaged.
Oh, his core purpose is very clear. It's about opportunity and equality. It's about ensuring that everybody in the country can live their own lives to the full.
Gordon Brown had made a big point of staking his claim to the higher moral ground. He had quoted the words of his father, a Presbyterian minister.
But I'll never forget these words he left me with. We must be givers as well as getters. Put something back, and by doing so, make a difference. And this is my moral compass. This is who I am.
Gordon's moral compass. Have you ever seen his moral compass?
Not in terms of it physically existing and showing me northwest by southeast, no. But genuinely what I've seen is maybe call it a sense of moral conviction.
The danger of Gordon Brown, if you talk about morality, if you talk the talk but don't walk the walk, if you don't implement what you're saying, then of course people become not just disillusioned, they also become cynical about the moral compass you've been talking about.
One of the most important pillars of Gordon Brown's reputation was his record of concern for the poor and disadvantaged. As Chancellor, he'd substantially, if quietly, taken money from the better off and given it to the worse off. But in his last budget, before he moved into number 10, he'd financed a crowd-pleasing cut in the basic rate of income tax by abolishing the 10p band, hitting millions of those on lower incomes. Plenty of people warned him that there'd be trouble ahead.
Well, the Treasury Select Committee, in its Budget 2007 report, examined the Chancellor of the Exchequer at that time, Gordon Brown. And we asked him about the 5.3 million losers. I don't think he took that on board as he should have.
Answering MPs' questions a year later, the most senior civil servant in Britain confirmed that Treasury officials had warned Gordon Brown about the consequences for poorer people.
In the run-up to a budget, the Treasury will have advised the Chancellor on the aspects of his tax policies and the distributional consequences of the decisions he was making, absolutely.
Gordon Brown's successor as Chancellor soon discovered there was a problem. When did you realise that actually there were going to be several million losers as a result of this?
When I became Chancellor, and as you open the books, if you like, and you say, look, what are the problems we're facing, I knew this was a problem.
When Gordon Brown refused to act on these warnings, the issue erupted in voter discontent and a backbench revolt led by Frank Field.
The Prime Minister has been in denial. He's been in denial since I met him a year ago to argue that we should have a programme of compensation in place.
Gordon Brown would thump the table and claim there were no losers. When he tried to maintain that line at a sulphurous confrontation with his parliamentary party, some of them shouted back at him. Now the Prime Minister was being heckled, even by his own MPs. When he's made up his mind about something, how easy is it then to change his mind?
Not easy. Quite rightly. Because he's thought long and hard about it.
Just when Labour needed its activists to be in fighting spirits for the May elections, the 10p tax disaster was angering even the most loyal of the loyal.
The 10p tax issue was toxic. In my local General Committee, people were outraged about it.
The Tories won London, and in the May local elections elsewhere, Labour was hammered into third place.
And of course, it's the very people we're trying to help who are complaining most about the abolition of the 10p income tax band. I mean, that point, more than any other single point, was what was raised on the doorstep.
There's been a cost, there's no doubt about it. You know, you can see that in the polls.
There were people who showed me their payslips. There were people who were affected, and what they said was, we don't expect this from a Labour government. This is the sort of thing the Tories do.
Gordon Brown had even given David Cameron the space to pose as the defender of the poor.
Under this government, there are 600,000 more people in extreme poverty than when they came to power.
The 10p tax issue hit the pockets of only a minority of voters, but it was seen by many more as symbolic of a Prime Minister who'd become detached from both his own values and the concerns of the country.
At a cost of £2.7 billion, I will increase the individual personal tax allowances.
So threatening was the scale of the backbench revolt that the Prime Minister finally had to sanction a massive and costly climb down. But even this attempt to buy himself out of trouble couldn't avert a disastrous defeat at the Crewe by-election, a Labour seat since World War II.
Edward Timpson, Conservative, 20,530.
Despite Labour's attacks on the Conservative candidate as a Tory toff, it was Gordon Brown that voters thought was out of touch with ordinary people and their struggle to make ends meet.
I understand that the message of the British public is clear and unequivocal. They want us to address these challenges, and I believe that I can do so.
As a portent of the future, Crewe offers a frightening prospect to the Labour Party.
Will Labour win the next election?
That's a matter for the electorate. I think we still could under Gordon, but we've got a long way to go.
He struggles in Parliament, he struggles with the media, he struggles with the fact that he's having difficulties holding his party together.
Shakespeare said, sorrows come not single spies but in battalions, and that's in a sense what has happened.
If you go and ask any Labour MP, I think they will find it quite difficult at the moment to say, what are we doing? What is the story? And if we can't do it, we shouldn't be thinking that the voters can supply that for us.
Gordon Brown has gone from the hero of last summer to the sub-zero of this June. And what must really disappoint him is that his worst wounds have not been inflicted by the Conservatives or by the media, but by himself. The supreme leader of a year ago cannot now even be certain that his party will let him lead them into the next general election.